it would be helpful if we spent the next 40 minutes, at least the beginning of it, and we worked to explore more the role of family.
What?
The role of family
Okay.
in this whole spiritual quest. We've touched on it, but it hasn't really been put right in the middle. So I think that might be a good place to start.
Certainly I touched on in my talk, the failure of family has been a big issue in the meaning crisis and in the destruction of it. There's no question about that.
Yeah, Eberstadt is, I think, really clear evidence for that, like just very clear.
Yeah. And the industrializations, and I think AI is going to be a part of that too, all of these things just sort of ripping family apart. And that leaving then, it's cascading intergenerational trauma, destruction.
And I think Eberstadt is right. As that happens, spirituality, religious commitment declines, and spirituality becomes more superficial. And it's in general. There's of course important exceptions, etc., but there's a very strong correlation between that. That's why she entitled the book the way she did, How the West Really Lost God.
Yeah.
And that, I think, has to do a lot with when you're losing the home range and the home base and the hearth and the hospital, you're losing all of these cognitive functions, you're losing access to the vertical, like the range of the horizontal shrinks, all kinds of things happen.
Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that even to be fair to people who criticize that they don't like the family values discussion, right? And I understand that. And I think a way to see what has been happening, at least for the past several decades, is that it's not just the family that's being eroded in some ways, it's all intermediary bodies. It's a good way to understand that. So it's the idea is that the way reality works is a fractal relationship of embedding identities into each other. And that has, so you could say the family is an example of it, you know, the wider family is an example of it, the way in which your family is connected to the other people in your town or in your group, whatever that is, you know, there's all types of levels of these intermediary structures. That has also been eroded, right? So my grandfather was a Knight of Columbus and it was all these things, and they had all these types of participations that we can't even understand anymore. It's so weird to us when you look at it. If you look at the Middle Ages, that's one of the things that characterizes the Middle Ages, that everybody was part of like 15 different associations, like this group that celebrates the feast day of this saint, and they have their uniforms and their colors and their banners, and you know they spend months like preparing the feast of this saint, and they bring it, you know. So there's all these like intermediary cascading celebrations and participations that used to constitute the world. And one of my analyses of, let's say, the end of modernity is that, or modernity itself, is that it seems to be something like a deincarnation, is the best way to understand it, is that things move higher and lower. And often it's hard for people to see the structure because they tend to go either way. They tend to say something, oh, the world is so chaotic and everybody's doing what they want and nobody gets along, and so they think that it's just going lower. So it's going towards chaos. But that's not what's happening. It's going lower and then it's going higher. And so the systems of control are moving higher and higher. And the structures that control us or that act top down on us, they're moving up towards global systems and you know, world governments or whatever it is that you want to describe. So that's the biggest problem. And if we get into in culture wars where you just have the up and the down fighting each other, or you don't see that the problem is all the way through, then you're not going to be able to capture what's going on. So that's why. Now, what's funny about that is in that way, Jordan Peterson is right to a certain extent. That in that situation, the only thing you can do is orient the multiplicity inside you in a proper hierarchy. And if you do that, then you have a better chance of fitting into higher participations to participate in families, to participate in different groups, in churches, all of that, and that it'll kind of build itself bottom up. Because AI, one of the things that AI is going to do is create insane levels of control top down that you will never have seen in the history of the world, and we're going to have to have the government tell us what is real. We're going to need an authority up there to tell you what's real. There's no way around it anymore. Because in 2 months, you'll get a phone call, and it'll be your daughter on the phone, but it won't be your daughter. And so you'll need a way to know what's real and what's real. And the only way to do that is to move up and to create more powerful structures that decide or tell you what is real. And so, yeah, sorry. And so there's a total relationship between it's going to accelerate, that's for sure. And so the only way to do it is, I think it's to build bottom up at this point. There's no other way.
I think one of the things that, and I think within this little corner, part of what's interesting about the mix is we're going to have to figure out how to navigate traditionalisms. Because there is no going back to the pre-industrial. And if you look at the family, the evolution of the family through the industrial, family, of course, used to be extended family. Mary Harrington has written a fair amount about this in terms of how women worked, how men worked, and of course there's huge variety. And we're in a place now where I think with the disintegration and disruption of at least the structures and institutions we have inherited, there's going to be a continual hunger and an attempt to reappropriate traditions. But I think what we've seen through modernity is that many attempts to reappropriate pre-modern traditions, and we've talked about this with respect to, I mean, you said, someone said witch at some point. The entire history of witchcraft is fascinating because it's almost always sort of a reappropriation of something that they sort of thought they knew back there, and so you have these modern witches that really don't have any connection. You've spoken about this before. It's a lot of neo-pagans that I'm going to now worship Thor, and you mean you're going to worship Thor through what the Christians wrote because they saw all of this stuff receding? And so I think part of what we're going to see are a lot of grabbing at traditions, but when a modern person grabs, or a person today grabs at a tradition that's very old where, again, in all fairness, the continuity has been lost, they're grabbing at something of a replica. And again, if you look at...
A simulacra.
Yes.
Pastiche.
Yes. And so a big part of this is going to be, yes, we need, in fact, to be connected to tradition, but we're going to have to figure out how to do that in a way that doesn't itself become yet another postmodern LARPing.
Yeah, LARPing. No, I totally agree. I think I coined the phrase even before this whole corner of the internet, because I carved icons, and I always said tradition without nostalgia, right? That those two things are not the same, and the discovery of forms of participation do not necessitate fetishization of idiosyncratic aspects of form, right? So, but it's sometimes hard to tell the difference, but you definitely see that in the Christian world, in some traditionalist Christian tendencies to fetishize, and you see it's usually true when they fetishize a certain moment in time.
Yes.
You know, it's like, you know, if we could just go back to the Trent, like if we just go back to, or Vatican I, you know, or if we could just go back to just go back to this golden age or whatever, and then you try to turn back the clock. That never works. But there is a way. One of the reasons why I am a Christian is because the line is not broken. The line isn't broken, whereas the line to Thor is totally broken, and it makes it a form of necromancy. There are many lines that have been broken for good or for ill. You can complain about it, or but it's just true. There are no druids. By probably, even in the time of Caesar, there were probably almost no druids left. So when you meet a druid, you're making it up, dude.
Right.
This is ridiculous. You're LARPing totally. And so I think there are real lines that still continue. And to be totally generous, like there are lines that are not Christian that are at least legitimate, that have a kind of legitimacy and connection and a transmission. But there's most of the stuff that you see now is just nonsense. And people, especially a lot of the esoteric stuff, like people who want to recapture like the supposed esoteric aspects of this or that, usually they're just making it up.
And how this applies to family, so when we look at, let's say, the conversation about family values in the 80s, which tended to look back to the 50s, which tended to look at the nuclear family as, Leave It to Beaver or Ozzie and Harriet, that certainly was a family, but it was sort of an idealization of what was at that point still sort of a industrialized, fractured fragment of a family.
And it's just like scaling up the problem one level before. It's like, we realize that all these fractured individuals that just like live alone and are completely, and don't have contact with the outside, are falling into nihilism. If we could just go back to the family that was like that lived in all their little suburban homes next to each other and, didn't engage with their neighbors and barely knew anybody. If we could just go back to that, if you find that's ridiculous. Right? And so I agree, like when I hear the left-wingers say, it takes a village, and then I hear the right-wingers freak out because they hate that idea. Well, I'm sorry, but that's actually the best way to go, is to understand that your family has to be connected with other families, or else what are you doing,
And yet we are living, so when I was in the Netherlands, first time I'd ever been there, you drive through this beautiful countryside and you see the little spire and there's a little village around it. That ended 500-600 years ago. It did in many places in the world, and you can still appropriate it. My family in Whitensville, Massachusetts, my cousin's family, most of them still there, blue-collar workers. I opened with that. I didn't open, but I had that Andrew Root story in the middle of my talk because that entire story, he's in an airplane because he's getting his education in Los Angeles, and his family of origin is in Minnesota, and she came from another place. And so then, we've got AI, we've got nets and jets. We are surrounded by things that have taken apart what we knew to be human beings. At what point? Are you going to pre-agricultural, post-agricultural? So, and then in fact, of course, science rises to try to get at, well, what is a human? And science can't really say that. We can describe a whole lot about it, but these are serious things. And so go ahead.
No, but I think this goes also even to some of the practices that you have that I think it's important to see. And Rod Dreher, he's obsessed with this. Like he touches on this. But I think that there's something about the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil that is related to what is happening. In some ways, what happens in the fall is that there's an increase of knowledge. That does actually happen. And there is an increase in, you see it in the story, there's an increase in techne, an increase in civilization. And that is different forms of alienation which set themselves up in the world. Now, for every level of alienation, something which before was natural and nobody thought about, it's just the way it was, now has to become deliberate. And so we have to be deliberate. There's no other way. The idea that in the past, like a village would have existed by necessity. It's not like these people liked each other. It's not like these people were like, oh, we need to come together, and if we pay attention to the same thing, then we're all going to... Nobody thought about that stuff. They just had to live and had to make food and survive, and their kids had to marry other people so that life would continue. There was just the world of necessity would force a more balanced relationship between the levels of the hierarchy. But now the only way to do it is to be deliberate, and to look at it and to decide, right? And so the idea, for example, of in that problem of this kind of weird cosmopolitan reality where we don't know anything, and the kind of silly idea that me, the French Canadian guy whose parents converted from Catholicism to become Baptists, and now I'm becoming Orthodox, and how ridiculous that is. But nonetheless, it has to be deliberate. There's no other way anymore. And so I have to say, yes, that's it, that's my path. This is where I am. I will go to church, and I worship, and I try to commune with the people around me, and there's something about it. I wouldn't say LARPing. There's something about it which is a little forced,
Yep.
and it kind of has to be, because it's the only way back.
And yet here you are. We're not. Tomorrow we will be in an Orthodox church, and you and the Father will share with us the riches of that church. And this church is sharing with us the riches and capacities of this church. And John is sharing with us the riches and capacities of all of what he brings to the table. And again, I'm not saying we are not going to, we are going to have to go to tradition, but we are going to have to go to it with a knowledge of, like you said to how many guys on the internet who couldn't understand you, you have to know where you are. And that where you are matters to the way that we look at tradition and how we appropriate it. And to a degree to know that I am not in Armenia or in Georgia or in Kiev or in Geneva or in London. I am here, and we are there, and by God's grace, he is still with us, even if all of these other structures of necessity, our new necessities, are bringing different challenges to us. Because if you were from, 100 years ago, what we're doing right now would not have happened.
But so then in terms of family, I think that's what we have to be deliberate about family. We can't just let it happen. It's just not possible anymore. And like I said, most of our ancestors would have had family meals for the simple reason that you have to eat. So you make the food and it's hot, so it's like now's the time to eat because now the food is made and now it's hot. But that would still create that powerful coming together in relationship. It would. But now we have microwaves and Uber Eats or whatever, and we have fast food, and we have so much food in the fridge anyways that you have to be deliberate about family meals, because we could just eat and not have to be together at all, and you could do that for weeks and you would never notice that this is going on. And so that it seems like that's what we just have to. And so the same for birthdays, the same for any celebration. We just have to be deliberate about it if we want the family to become a place where we can engage with the true patterns of reality.
And yet, before you talk, because I have something I do want you to say, I'll tell you, when I told that part of the reason I chose that story from Andrew Root was that, again, I have heard many of your stories. I've spent a lot of time on my channel listening to randos, and it's from the wreckage. Tell Eamon's story about his parents that we've told on the channel in the marriage crisis videos.
Sure. Eamon will probably watch this later, so hopefully I get it all right. I'm assuming you're talking about yeah. So they both grew up outside the church. Both of their families were broken families. His mother's side, mother married, had several children, abusive husband. That marriage broke up, led to a marriage to another man, which his mother is the fruit of. And his father's marriage was broken up. So 2 broken homes, not involved in the church, not involved in faith. And then they came together, they met one another, they she wanted to get married in a church, and so this is the story you want? Yeah. They wanted to get married in the church, and so the pastor said, sure, but you have to read the Bible, before you can come in. So they did, and eventually my father-in-law decided to commit himself to the church, commit himself to God, and the thing that has driven him quite a bit, maybe not driven, but guided him, has been his commitment to not repeat that pattern going forward with his family. To say, okay, both of my parents, they came from broken homes. My wife's family, it was broken up, but we're not going to do that with our children. And so despite challenges that have come up, which do for everyone, they've chosen that they will remain together and faithful, and that has been a great gift. And it doesn't always work that way, but if we are going to be able to try to rebuild a structure that can have family built in together, that can begin to build from the bottom up, maybe these hierarchies that we need for a fuller communal life, you have to decide, even though I come from wherever I come from, and I have all the trauma that I'm bringing in and all of my trouble, I will take a vision for what is good, and I will commit myself to that path despite what comes, even if I'm not particularly happy for portions of it, because of that vision of the good that will only come through my participation in this greater vision. And that commitment from his parents has been a huge blessing for me and my husband. They've been around for our children. They've been able to support his siblings. So.
Is that the family question? All right. Talked about family.
I do wonder, so my thought is, there's so many of these patterns that we want to reinstantiate, because if we don't reinstantiate them, it all falls apart, and there's all this suffering. But so often you can't just take the old pattern and drop it down and say, we're going to do that same thing again. So what would be the essential elements to family that would need to maybe be discovered in each of our quests for our spiritual homes? What would those elements necessarily be to still produce a life-giving pattern?
I don't know. Again, I think this is sort of the modern imagination. The modern imagination is, here are all the elements, we are going to do it. And if there's one thing I think I've learned from John's work, is that we can get indications, we can get clues, and from your work, we don't tend to navigate that way. We tend much more to, usually we navigate badly, but if there is in fact something that we are shooting for, we can begin to go, because a family, a community, a church, again, I was talking to some people here who, they're mentioning a massive church north of Sacramento, grew out of a tiny little church, and that tiny little church stayed a tiny little church, and the massive church went. Why do some things go and why do some things not go? We don't know. It doesn't mean we should be ignorant, but if we think, here are all the elements of a family.
No, but I would say the only thing we can do is build on what we have. So, there are no, and you kind of, at least, I mean, in my life, I feel like I have a good family. We have our issues or whatever, but we love each other and we like being together. And we just build on the things that seem available to you. You talk about affordance, and there's something about family in which you have to be sensitive to that affordance. And in some ways, it means it depends on where your family is. It depends on how much conflict and whatever is there. But, there are little things that are still available. Like for example, celebrating certain things usually is available to all of us. You talked about Christmas. That is definitely still available to us. And it's possible to take something like Christmas and turn it into, a strong moment for the family. And that you just work at that. You decorate the home, you make a nice meal, you get people, you put on Christmas music, it sounds ridiculous, but there are things that are available to us. Like in our family, for example, we have birthdays, and we celebrate birthdays several times for each person. You know, there's like, we have our own little celebration, and then we invite people over. And so it's something that we do because there aren't a lot of those festal things left in the world, but birthdays are something we still sing happy birthday. In school, they still mention it. So we do that, and we've developed certain little rituals that are very simple, but that are very powerful. For example, when we have a birthday meal, we just go around the table and everybody has to say what they like about the person whose his birthday. It's very simple. It's not much, but now everybody looks forward to it, and everybody has to kind of prepare themselves because they know that that's gonna happen. And in some ways, you have to reconcile yourself a little bit with that person because you're gonna have to give them a compliment, you know, at least once a year. But there's, like you said, it's not the example. I'm not saying do that. I don't know what you have to do, but I think you have to be sensitive to what is available and if you try to push too hard, then it doesn't land. If you're like, all right, we're gonna celebrate the 12 days of Christmas this year, and like get your candles and whatever thing, and this day's that day. Like it's just, you know, maybe some people can do that, but most of us can't. And so it's like to get like we celebrate Epiphany. We can do that as a family. There's a little French-Canadian tradition of, you know, making a cake with a bean in it, and whoever gets the bean is the king of the day. And it's like, so we have these little things that we try to intersperse during the year so that So I think you just have to be attentive to what's available to you.
And I think it's also going to be very important going forward not to idolatrize families, not to make family idols either. And Rod Hare, our other partner in the marriage crisis conversations, points out that we will likely have, for the next 100 years, a significant amount of the numbers of people living alone who are single are rising again and again. Many women I just read a fascinating article, maybe I can put it on the Discord, beautiful testimony of one woman who realized she was dating and then by age 22, no longer getting asked out on dates. And now she's in her 40s. And my sermon tomorrow is on the Ethiopian eunuch. And the punch of that passage is that eunuch coming back from Jerusalem gets met by Philip and is reading the prophet Isaiah, where there is a prophecy that there is going to be something for that eunuch that, boy, if there was an idolatrous view of the family, you know, look at Abraham or Rachel and Leah. Family is everything. And so, you know, we ought to be careful to help those who will not have a nuclear family or a biological family, to help them find home as well.
And that's where the village comes in, and because in some ways if we fetishize the nuclear family, then we have that problem. But if we see how all of this works together, right? There in every culture, there's a role for that aunt that didn't get married and spoils the kids, and you know, and they love because she's kind of a little wild and she's kind of exciting, and so she can have a bit of motherhood by proxy without actually being a mother. And so it's just, I'm not saying there's one way to do it, but I think that if we understand how these organic systems have ways of compensating, if we're together and we're not completely isolated from each other, then there are all kinds of possibilities that present themselves. So
I don't have anything to add to that. Is my mic on?
Yes.
I mean, maybe, I think it would be, like, I agree with everything. I have I'm worrying about bias. I have a more tortured relationship with family. And it's actually, it's been something, struggle's not the right word, it's something that Sarah and I had to work a lot on, because she's in a Persian extended family, and man, is that a family. And for a long time, they were like, that's Sarah, and she's important, and you're probably not good enough for her. And so I had to hang in there. But now they've really embraced me, and so I like seeing that and being a part of it. I think I want to add to what Paul said and speak from what I just said. I have to sometimes remind Sarah that she grew up in, like I sometimes tell her that she grew up on Krypton. This amazing family. Her father is the scientist who has the current model of photosynthesis, right?
Wow.
Yeah, exactly. and they're all like that. And it's like, right?
And you
so-
don't fit in?
I was gonna say.
Okay. I usually I have to bring my A game pretty continuously. But no, that's not the point I'm making. The point I'm making is I didn't come from that. And so I don't presume that people are as rational and as flexible and as committed to the true and the good and beautiful as Sarah does. And I have to say, you have to see that, no, that's too strong. I invite her to see that there's lots of people that don't have that family, and therefore a lot of the presumptions you have about human beings and how they'll interact with you, they don't have those presumptions and presuppositions. And so, while I agree with everything you're saying, this is not to undermine it. It's like, but it's extending on something you said. It's like, we have to be very careful that a lot of the people, especially like the nuns, they don't come from a family that was on Krypton, right? They come from sometimes single parent families and broken families, and I'm trying to get that that's not just their social interaction, that goes into deep presuppositions about how other human beings are. And so one of the things we might do, I agree with you, it's both. Like, it has to grow organically, but we have to make deliberate commitments. And saying it's something that would be doing both of those is, I think we have to deliberately educate people on that the project of making a person is titanic and overwhelming and the most important thing you're ever going to do in your life. It's more important than your career. It's more important than anything else, perhaps than to your relationship to ultimate reality. Like, making a person, right, is just like, and you know, my children and my stepchildren tell me I've been a good father. That's always been a concern of me because I did not have a good relationship with my father. And and I don't mean this in a condescending way, I mean it in a mentoring way. Being a good teacher you should be committed to person making and not just information transmission. But I think it was natural to us, especially within a religious worldview, to appreciate the project of raising a person. And I think that is no longer something we can presume to be the case. So that's the connection I'm making to the loss of certain presumptions and presuppositions, and that we've got to now more deliberately make an effort to educate people about, especially now, about the value, the tremendous responsibility, the tremendous difficulty, the tremendous joy, and just the tremendous responsibility of making a person.
And what you often find is when you invest yourself into making a person, you yourself are made.
Always. There's no way of, well, even teaching, like, this is what I'm privileged I get to teach the graduate student teaching workshop, teach graduate students how to start to become teachers. And one of the things it's easy to say, but it takes a lot to convey, is you're only a good teacher to the degree to which you are sharing your own learning. If you think you've learned and then you're just giving, then you should retire because you're done. right? And so I think you can only grow up a child to the degree to which you are sharing your own growing up with them, and you reflect that back to them. No, I don't mean self-esteem and get down and Johnny's rights are the same as mine or all of that stuff that went disastrously wrong. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the fact that, it's very important. I'll try and make it concrete. It's very important to me that I genuinely apologize to my kids when I've done something wrong, and take time and not try to, because that I can't remember my parents ever doing that, right? But what I've found is, if I can admit to them that I've done wrong, they find it more capable of telling me when they've done something wrong. And then both of us, right, get the possibility of helping each other not to do the same wrong things. That's what I'm trying to talk about. I'm trying to get this idea of that, like I'll say to my kids. Well, I don't say it now because they're both adults now. But I used to say when they were growing up, I'll say, when I tell you no, I mean it. So that when I tell you I love you, you'll know that I mean it. You have to understand that I am trying my best to present to you what it is to be a consistent human being. But if they catch me in an inconsistency, and I don't mean a little like going, Dad, you said that. I mean like, right? Then you have to, if you don't admit you toggle between admitting, when you're learning, you toggle between admitting what you've gotten wrong and also trying to present what you think is right. And so for me, that project with my children, is part of what it is just to try to be a good person and to aspiring to be a good person. And so I totally agree with you. I think that the degree to which, my mother used to say this to me, and don't do what I do, do what I say. And it's like, you're wrong. You're actually wrong. That's not how kids work. They do what you do. They don't do what you say. They will only eventually start to do what you say if they're doing what you do and they grow up, because doing what you do grows them up. That's at least what I think.
I'll say a few more things then. It's a similar pattern with attachment as well, where
yes.
if you come from a place where you've had traumatic experiences, especially in your developmental ages, it's so hard to imagine attachment if you haven't experienced attachment.
Yeah.
But when you have your own children, it creates a new opportunity for a new type of attachment. But for that to go well, and this is why I appreciate you bringing up my husband's family, you have to be willing to dive into the massively risky and threatening environment of opening yourself up to attachment, so that you can allow for that.
Yeah.
Despite, for many of those people, it's a very unknown space. It's not just the risk, it's the unknown because they haven't attached before. But to be able to attach their children is a new opportunity that can afford them new engagement. And if they can move into that project with faith and hope and through love, then that can actually begin to work backwards through time to heal some of those other attachments and open up new attachment and broaden the capacity for outside of the family attachment to friends and other community members.
Attachment theory, like I often say, if I can only get 3 measurements from you, I want to know the measure of your general intelligence. I would say 4, the measure of your rationality, because they're not the same. I want to know your big 5 personality, and then I want to know your attachment style. And I have the privilege of working at U of T with one of the great authorities in the world on attachment. He's a friend of mine, Jeff McDonald, and I hope you take this the right way. But he says, you know, if you really want to understand romantic relationships, attachment theory is the way, the truth, and the life. And so what many people aren't, like when attachment, like I've had to face the fact that I have an anxious attachment style. And of course, there's a lot of good work you can do, and then you need to be in a secure attachment. So you really can't address, therapy helps a lot, but you can't address attachment issues until you're in a secure relationship. It's like, I'm going to play baseball by myself. Right? It just doesn't work, right? And so I think that part of Socratic self-knowledge should be getting very clear, very honestly clear about what your attachment styles are. Because, and here's because attachment goes into romantic relationships, and then romantic relationships tend to produce children, there's like a karmic thing in which the attachment, if it's not addressed, it's not just your crap, it gets passed on to your kids. And so I think it's tremendously important, and I should have been better at this. It's tremendously important to become aware of your attachment style, and there are pretty good ways of doing that. And that, first of all, if you're going into a romantic relationship and you don't know your attachment style, don't go into the romantic relationship. I really think that. If you want to improve your chances of not getting into a bad romantic relationship, becoming aware of your attachment styles is one of the wisest things you can do. Because for example, the research shows that one of the ways people magnetize is anxious attachment styles find avoidant attachment styles, and they find each other massively attractive, and they are massively mutually incompatible in the long term. Just as one example. And so I think before you enter into romantic relationships, I think before you enter into parenthood, take the time to do the work to find what your attachment style is, because the empirical evidence about how predictive it is of your behavior and to what degree you might be unaware of what it is. I think the evidence of that has reached the level of consensus conviction. It's one of the few areas, and so social psychology is going through the replication crisis on steroids. This is one of the theories that's not going through the replication crisis. So, and there are resources out there. There are lots of good resources now you can avail yourself of, and you can learn about this. It's just, if you really are cultivating wisdom, and the things that matter most are your familiar and romantic relationships in your life, one way to actually do that with integrity is to take the time to deeply learn what your attachment styles are, what the patterns are, and what the proclivities are, and what the prognosis is for how you could enter into avoiding disaster, and how you can enter into better kinds of relationships. So I think attachment, well, to the degree to which we're ignorant of something is the degree to which we are actually imprisoned by it. And attachment is tremendously powerful, way more powerful than people realize. I had to realize there was a hubris and an arrogance. I thought, well, I'm a psychologist, blah, 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 blah. No way. Certain trigger points got hit, and the attachment style just came out, and it was like, why am I know I shouldn't be, and right? So if you're ignorant of something that has that kind of power, that's a very, very detrimental disposition to be in. But you don't have to be. And don't try and learn, like, you don't learn martial arts when you're in a fight. You learn it before you're in the fight. Learn the attachment style before you're in the crisis, because then it's available for you.
One thought, I know we're out of time. We've been trying to talk about how to frame the right posture to get that meta-optimal grip. I think one way to say it might be, if you're in a posture of secure attachment with the ground of being, that will make that meta-optimal grip happen.
I think that's, this is Jonathan's fractal model. I think if you have a secure attachment relationship, all the way from the ground of being, like you should have a secure attachment relationship with the ground of being, you should have a secure attachment relationship with your spouse, with your kids. Like I was in Montana to give a talk. Guy Senstock and I were doing a Circling into Dialogos workshop, and there was all these tremendously, maybe they're cloned or something, I don't know. There's all these 20 and 30 somethings, and they're all just outrageously gorgeous and everything. And it was interesting for me, and Guy too, because we've both been through fractured things, and then we've come into, we've both been gifted with wonderful partners that have helped us come in. He was also anxious attachment style. We've both been gifted to come into a secure attachment style by both the inner work and then the work that can only be done by being in a secure attachment, just like you're saying. And the freedom that gave us in that situation is real. Like, it's funny how like the magnetism of things, it just goes away, because like you realize actually what I really, or at least I hope by now, what I'm really seeking is not an intense experience. I want a deep connection. And those are not the same thing. And you're just able to discern the difference. And like in Sophrosyn, it's like it's just like, whip. And we were both just, and it's, yeah. But I think if you can get on, I think there's a deep relationship. Maybe this is what you're saying. But I think there's a deep relationship between cultivating the meta virtue of Sophrosyn, where you're constantly tempted to the true, the good, and the beautiful, and being able to find a fractal, secure attachment style in the world. Yes, I totally agree with that.
Well, thank you. And I believe we have an hour for dinner.